Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Sorry to interrupt your probably very helpful networking conversations. Thanks for joining. Hopefully everybody is in the place that they want to be in to talk about working more effectively with folks with mental health and substance misuse issues. So I'll just give anyone a moment to get up and leave. I won't be offended. All right, so we all belong here. We also have some folks joining us online, and Adam is going to be trying to, as best as he possibly can, kind of connect us as part of one dialogue. So welcome. I first want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people and to express my gratitude to them for allowing us to learn and have this conversation together today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Kristi. I have been giving this workshop in some guise or another for quite some time. I have worked as an advocate in a number of capacities pretty much my whole adult life, which is longer than I will admit. So one of the things that has helped me be able to lead this or facilitate this conversation with you is that I ran a legal advocacy service for folks with mental health and substance misuse issues in Vancouver for about 13 years. And so really everything I've learned is really about working with clients and working with survivors directly. I want to make it clear that I'm not formally trained in this area. So I'm not a first responder. I'm not a therapist, not a doctor. But I'm someone who has been doing this work for a long time and someone who's made a lot of mistakes in my practice. And I've really benefited from not only the valuable feedback and insight that I've received from other advocates and colleagues, but as I said, most generously, a lot of this learning has come from people that were really patient and generous with me and really encouraged me to do better by expressing their needs to me. And so I think that's the most valuable learning that I can offer is what folks have told me. So a couple of things before we get started. First of all, I find these sessions to be most effective, especially when we're talking about issues like mental health and substance misuse, when there's a dialogue happening between the facilitator and the people in the room. I don't know most of you, but I can imagine that there's a lot of expertise in this room that you have to offer and to share with other participants. And I obviously invite folks to leave comments online. And again, Adam's going to be monitoring and sharing those with us. So really, if you have questions, if you have contributions to make, if there's something that's coming up for you, in whether it's a case scenario or particular client that you're working with and you're struggling with, or maybe you've had a real success story with that you want to share with everybody, please do that, because I think that's where the real learning happens rather than me just talking at you for the next 2 hours. So anytime you want to contribute, please do so. Two other things, especially if you're new to this work, there are going to be some things that we can't cover today that I think are really valuable learning. And if you can take advantage of taking these two trainings, I would highly recommend it. One would be some kind of nonviolent crisis intervention training, just in terms of, you're going to see a lot of folks who are really escalated, who are really frustrated, who are angry. And if you have some of those foundational skills already built into your toolbox, that's going to set you ahead. The other thing is there are organizations like Canadian Mental Health Association that do a mental health first aid course, which is, kind of a similar concept to doing like a CPR. It's a really foundational course that teaches you about mental health, what the symptoms are, and how to relate to and be compassionate with folks who are struggling with some of these issues. And for me, that was one of the things that was really helpful to me when I first started doing this work, was really understanding what it was folks were living with and how it might present itself. for people. And that gave me some awareness and some grounding to be able to be more effective in my work. So I would recommend definitely taking advantage of those opportunities if you can. Couple more things. One is, one of the things that often comes up when we're having conversations about clients with barriers, regardless of what those barriers are, is that there's a lot we can't do about those barriers, and it's very frustrating. And it's very easy for us to get stuck in all the ways in which the system is broken, or the systemic barriers are so present and feel so imposing that we feel immobilized, or we feel like, there's nothing we can do. So I want to acknowledge that we are dealing with, some structures that are really difficult to penetrate, that are really not adequate for the complex needs that many of these folks have. And that's always in the background of the work. And I did a session yesterday, and it came up many times. People talking about how frustrating it was to see clients who had multiple and complex needs, and knowing that as an advocate, your role is limited, right? You can't provide every service or resource that somebody needs, but there's nowhere to send people to. So I just think it's important that we recognize that we are kind of often band-aiding problems, or trying to pull together as many resources as we can for folks, and it's not enough. The last thing I want to say is that, and I wish somebody had said this to me when I was starting out, so I always like to open the training with this, which is, more than you think you know. So, most of us have a lot of experience working with people or being with people. So maybe we worked as a waiter or a waitress for many years and had to, that's a job where you have to manage a lot of different kinds of personalities. How well you get paid really depends on how attentive and responsive you are to somebody's needs. A lot of us have people in our families. We have partners, we have kids, we have friends who might have mental health issues. And we also work with a wide range of clients. So a lot of the skills that you have developed just naturally in your life, and also as an advocate, are going to serve you well in doing this work effectively with people with mental health issues. Things like empathy, active listening, paraphrasing, compassion, skill building, collaboration, all these things are extremely helpful. So there are no magic tricks. There's no one good answer for every scenario, but I just want you to know that really today is about maybe adding a few things to your toolbox or refining skills that you already have, but it's all there in you. So hopefully that provides some reassurance. So before we get started, typically what I like to do is have everybody introduce themselves. We don't have a lot of time, so we're not going to do that. And my apologies, but I certainly would invite people, if you have any questions before we get started, to ask them now. And again, to ask questions or share your comments as we move through the day. Anything so far? Cool. All right, anything online? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna do my best. I feel like I was saying to Adam, I feel like I'm playing some kind of sport where I'm trying to manage the microphone and this clicker at the same time. So let's talk a little bit. Really what we want to focus on today, I think, are some general best practices and tips about how we communicate and how we develop relationships with the clients that we're working with, and then to look at some specific sort of case scenarios that often come up for people. And again, I'm going to invite people to raise your own or share your own. We're going to have an opportunity to do that. But I think, again, as I was saying earlier, it's important to set some of the context of what folks are facing before they even come in and see us. And I don't think any of these things on this slide are going to be surprises to people in terms of what you're seeing when people are coming in. So before they're even, calling you up on the phone or showing up at your drop-in service or making an appointment. These are real life conditions that folks are experiencing and things that we need to be attuned to. So stigma and discrimination, the fact that our systems are very fragmented and very inadequate, especially when it comes to mental health and substance misuse, and that a lot of folks are coming to us with trauma. Most of the people that we work with are coming to us with trauma. And sometimes it can be really hard to distinguish what's trauma and what's a mental health issue. And sometimes they're very interconnected and inseparable from each other. And just the fact of living with a mental health issue and often with a substance misuse issue, and we know these things go together very well. That's not new knowledge. Most people have both. Just the, living with symptoms itself is a barrier, creates all kinds of barriers to understanding, to communication. And we're going to talk about some strategies about how you do the best that you can to manage that. Okay, so I think that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because I'd like to move through some of the skill building pieces, but I think it's important to recognize that even though we have done a tremendous amount of work, or people have done a tremendous amount of work, especially over the last 15, 20 years around stigma, it's still very present in people's lives. And I think it's still very present for people who have mental health issues and possibly even more present for people who have substance misuse. There is still an association of these issues as being some kind of, personal or moral failing, as being criminal issues rather than actually being health and social issues. And that can have, significant impacts on how your client is going to relate to you and how they're going to share information with you. There's a lot of, I know that, my experience of working with folks for a lot of years was that it often took a really long time in the relationship process and in the trust building process for people to actually share what was really going on for them. Like sometimes right? Like it's fairly self-evident. Someone doesn't necessarily even need to disclose that they have a mental health issue or that they're using, and you've been around the block enough to kind of go, okay, there's something that's not quite connecting here. But other folks are really good at being able to mask it or minimize it. And the reason people do that is because they're afraid of exclusion, they're afraid of marginalization, they're afraid of judgment. So it's something that comes into play when we're working with people because we don't necessarily know that we're getting the full story of what's really presenting itself for them in their lives. So assuming that stigma is a factor in most people's lives, how do we address that? What do people do to kind of counteract the impact of what stigma might look like? And before I get your responses to that question, I also want to ask you, do a lot of the folks that you work with have mental health issues? Like, is this a fairly common thing that you see? And how do you know? Do they tell you? Do you just make the assumption based on how they present or their behaviors? Anyone? Okay, so you just asked the question directly. Okay. What about other folks? Great. Okay. Anybody feel uncomfortable or not feel like you're unsure of how to approach it? Everybody's happy to have that conversation? Coming in line? Okay, so you're getting some information up front. All right. What about, yes? I just going to say you can, well, nobody put up their hands, say that they feel uncomfortable. I think that's a experience. Yes.
Test. There we go.
Now I have the ability to be able to open that conversation, and it doesn't make me uncomfortable. What
Right.
makes me uncomfortable is if somebody hesitates on sharing, I want to know what that is. Am I making you uncomfortable? Do you feel
Mhm.
safe?
Right.
And I let people know that I'm coming from a place of no judgment.
Yes.
I'm here to help you as much as possible, and I'm not going to judge you no matter what you tell me. So,
Right.
yeah, I think
Okay.
it comes with experience.
I think so as well. And I think, again, the conversation has shifted a lot over the last 10 years. When I was doing this, doing these workshops, maybe in like 2006, 2007, people were like, I'd never asked someone if they had a mental health issue. Like they were aghast by that idea of like being so open. And and my response to that was, okay, well, we need to really look at our own discomfort, like, and what that's about, and what kind of message that's sending to someone about the meaning that we ascribe to having a mental health issue. And I think partly it shows the movement of the fact that we are having these conversations more openly, and a lot of work has been done to undermine, some of those assumptions. I do think it's still a factor. I do think it's a factor when it comes to using substances as well. We might be a little bit more understanding of mental health issues now, but I still think there is a lot of societal judgment around substance misuse. And people tend to hesitate to disclose how much that is impacting their lives. And that can be a really hard conversation to have with someone, because they may not want to tell you, they may not trust you enough to tell you how much of a factor that is for them. So, one of the things that I learned, and one of the most important things that I think, folks who've been doing this work a really long time know about working effectively with clients is really, it's a lot about trust building and developing a relationship over time with people, and not necessarily expecting that you're going to get the kind of disclosure that you feel like you need right away. Like, when we were having a conversation yesterday, people were talking about how difficult it can be to get information from people about what it is that their needs are. And, how do I deal with that? And I'm not sure that there is an easy answer to that question, right? Like, it's very individual based. And it's also really about the fact that, people, especially people with trauma and people who've had involuntary interactions with the system, it is natural for them to be mistrustful and to withhold information, because they're not sure of what the consequences are going to be of sharing that information. So it's, recognizing that it's not personal, and that's a part of how people protect themselves. It's a survival skill, and that really our job is to create a safe and trustworthy environment for people to share. So it sounds like people are already well aware that this is an issue, and are willing to have those conversations. I mean, I was in a bit of a particular position at the Kettle because we had a mandate, right? Our mandate was to work with people with mental health issues. So it was kind of a given that people would be in that position, and we had to be quite clear and careful about saying, this is what we do. If you're self-diagnosed or self-disclosing, that's good enough for us. But that's not necessarily true for everybody else. And so I think in terms of having that conversation with somebody, I think it really depends a lot on the person. Like, some people are really happy if you come to them and say, like you were saying, like, do you have some health issues that are going on for you? Do you have a mental health diagnosis? Other people, that's going to scare them off right away, right? They're going to be like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't have mental health problems. Like, I'm not using. Like, why are you making that assumption about me? And so, one of the approaches that I would often take is just keeping it really open-ended and asking questions about people's general wellness. Things like, are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you seeing friends? Who are you connected to? What support services are you accessing? And the benefit of having those open-ended conversations is that it doesn't confine the information. that you're going to get from somebody about something, right? It really broadens the kind of feedback that you're going to get from that person, and kind of naturally leads to other steps in the conversation, right? You're going to learn stuff that maybe you might not learn if you'd asked a really direct question. You're going to be able to have some of those, sort of outside or circle conversations. The other thing that I found really helpful about asking open-ended questions is that it allows you to kind of assess people's thought and speech patterns. So that can tell you a lot about what's going on for someone, right? The way that they speak, like how tangential they are, how coherent they are, what kind of language they use. And that may give you some clues, right, about what's going on for someone. So I don't think there's a right or a wrong approach to this. I think it's just really about having the conversation and, again, building that trust over time so that you're getting as much from that person as you possibly can about what's actually going on in their lives. Okay, so again, I think this is all really self-evident for us, that folks are coming to us with a high level of frustration, feeling like they're being shifted from resource to resource, feeling like the burden of coordinating the care that they need is falling on them and that systems are really disjointed, and that there's a lack of adequate services. I think this, it's really hard to speak on a provincial level about anything because resources are so variable, but certainly it seems like in the mental health field, no matter what community that you're living in, there are not enough services for people, and that people cannot access essential mental health care. And that is obviously incredibly problematic. Yes.
So there's also like incorrect diagnosis and huge problems with freedom in the province of BC. If you are if a doctor decides, I don't know how you can do that in 15 minutes necessarily, usually, but that you need to be admitted to hospital or you need to be given medication. And I don't know how to help people, because unless they have a mental health hearing coming up, or they are in Vancouver and I can say, please talk to someone at Kettle because they might know more than me. And it's frightening and scary and very ableist and sanist. And I don't know how much this comes up for other people, but it's like when you have that mental health label or the addiction label, nothing else matters. Any other legitimate underlying condition is not even factored in. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. But also it might help, especially if anyone is new, to understand that that's an additional reason people aren't maybe disclosing things as much as they'd like to.
Hear you.
I did write something down just as soon as I came in because it was something I wanted to talk about, was the elitist attitude that I feel the professionals, the doctors have around mental health. And the other thing is, and I work at the Downtown Eastside Women's Center for the past 21 years. So I'd say without judgment, I'll say 85% of the women I work with have mental health and addiction issues. But I want to say when I wanted to go to their meetings with their doctors to help them voice what it is that they need, I find that I'm treated pretty badly by the medical staff always. And we are lucky in Vancouver that we can refer our clients to class to get that I kind of use them more than I ever did before because of that reason. I think you have to have training for them to respect anything you have to say. And so they look at, they don't necessarily listen. But one of the things that breaks my heart the most that I wanted to talk about was that we have women who are really mentally ill and they're just staying in their psychosis for very long periods of time. They don't get checked by anybody for anything. Their blood pressure isn't checked. Any complaints that they might have about their physical health is completely ignored. And then they're at the end stage of cancer by the time it's diagnosed. And I find that's the most, because, why should they have to die? they're struggling with their mental health issues and their addictions, but they have cancer and nobody
Absolutely.
knows.
Yeah.
So that's not just one time it's happened to me. It's probably happened in the last 21 years, maybe half dozen times. And even their family didn't know. Nobody knew.
Mhm.
So that's, I guess, what I'm criticizing is service delivery for the
Right.
mentally ill.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very common experience for folks with mental health issues. But both of those two things. One being, especially if you have what's called a severe and persistent mental illness, and you're someone who's experiencing, I see, yeah, psychosis, or you're dealing, you have very strong suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. You have that history. You often have a history of involuntary engagement with hospitals, with physicians, with doctors. And so naturally, any disclosure is kind of in the shadows of what the consequences were for coming forward and asking for help. And having spent a little bit of time in a psychiatric unit myself, voluntarily, but still, it's not a pleasant place to be at all. I think, again, there's probably improvement since that period of time, but so I think being really upfront with clients about the fact that, one, you can empathize with how deeply traumatizing and difficult that experience must have been for them. And that there are limits. I mean, the thing is that, you have to be honest about the fact that there are limits on rights to confidentiality. And if you really believe that someone is going to hurt themselves or someone else, there is an imperative to act on that. And so having that conversation with somebody before they start telling you their story, but also, one of the things that I found it was really important for me to do in my work was to be really clear about distinguishing who I was and what I was doing from all these other systems that people were engaged in. Because, the most really marginalized people have endless engagement and endless interactions with the system. And how can you distinguish who's who? Like, people would think I was a social worker. People would think I was a welfare worker. And so one of the things I did really early on in the relationship was say, I'm not interested in monitoring your symptoms. I'm not interested in monitoring your use. I want to help. And I am completely separate from all of these other agencies. And at the same time, there are rare situations where, if I believe a child's at risk, or if I believe there's a risk of immediate harm, I may have to act on that. But I'm also going to walk you through that. I'm also going to be with you. I'm not going to phone the police and go, okay, come get this person. I am going to be present. I am going to continue to advocate for you. I'm going to help you take those necessary next steps. And because we can't guarantee, we can't guarantee that those kinds of terrible things won't happen to folks, but we can hopefully mitigate the harm, and hopefully do some of the work to build voluntary relationships. And that's part of the problem with the fact that our system is so broken, is that people have those moments in their lives where they really want help, right? They're like, okay, I'm done. I'm done with this lifestyle. Or, God, that last episode of depression was so brutal, it almost killed me. I'm ready. And they go and they ask for help, and they look for help, and it's not there. And then a week goes by and a month goes by, and then they're like, well, what was the point of asking for help if there's no help available? So trying to look at ways we can create voluntary and healthy relationships with some of those services, I think hopefully helps mitigate the likelihood of a coercive relationship.
Just some comments from the chat from Heather at CMHA South Caribou. Relevant to that, said less services in rural areas, especially interior and northern BC.
Yeah.
And not everyone has access to the internet to connect with the online services.
Yes. So I worked in Vancouver for most of my career. And then I moved north. I moved to Quesnel, and I was doing gender-based violence collaborative work. And it was so eye-opening to me because you become quite, Vancouver's kind of the Toronto of Canada, right? You become very like provincial in a way, and you think, oh, this is what it's like for everybody. And then, but the reality is that it's very different in rural communities, just in terms of resource. Like sometimes the advocate is the only person available. I see you. And there's no buses. There's no way to get from point A to point B unless you hitchhike, and we know what a risk that presents. And yeah, just basic internet service. Like I would travel, 20 or 30 minutes outside Quesnel to go on an adventure, and I wouldn't have service for hours. So some of those really basic needs are not being attended to. So yes, of course, you're meeting people at a really, really high level of crisis. Sorry, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the small community piece. I'm from Portland.
Okay.
We had a psychiatrist working for the mental health and substance use agency in our place. He retired probably 8 months ago, and there's still a job ad out. I know for a fact that he had a caseload of about 3,000 patients.
Are you kidding me?
He was the only, we have had two psychiatrists. One is at the psych ward in the hospital and only stays there and only works there and does not take on anyone. And then we had the other guy that was in the community. Like I said, he's been gone for 8 months. There's no sign of them. Nobody's applied for the job.
It's devastating.
And then couple that with, if you do have a person that's ready to make the change and you get them to the mental health and substance use or to a counselor, and the counselor's like, oh, this is great. Come back in 9 months for your first appointment.
Exactly. I'm dead in 9 months.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like, you kind of, as an advocate, you do take on those roles because there's no one else out there to do them.
Mm-hmm.
There just isn't.
Yeah.
And you hope that maybe you can just kind of help the person stay relatively stable until those services come in. But like I said, I've been in a holding pattern for a long, long time, and it doesn't look like it's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be frustrating.
Yeah.
I think I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And I really think, COVID has really, things were bad before COVID for sure. And one of the things that I heard working with service providers across the province, but especially in the north and rural places, was that we just can't fill positions. We can't keep social workers. We can't keep police officers. We can't keep anti-violence workers. And I think that reality is even worse now, right? A lot of people went, okay, I'm retiring or I'm getting out of this world altogether. And
I think there's an entirely new population of people that none of us have ever really interacted with
Right.
before that are now suddenly facing homelessness
Yes.
for the first time in their lives.
Yes.
Or they're overwhelmed with anxiety that they've never experienced in their lives.
Mhm.
Or, all these different factors. So, when we look at our playbooks of like, oh, I know what to say for this person because, this is the 8th eviction notice I've helped them with.
Right.
You can't use that same approach with somebody that's never faced this and they have no idea what it looks like.
Yeah.
It's
No, that
it's
isn't
just an
that
extra layer,
true.
right?
Yeah. So how do you have those conversations? I think that's a really interesting conversation to have because again, that's not something that's up here on this slide, but the fact that housing insecurity and homelessness is, it's always existed for people who are poor. And now it's a reality for people who are less poor or middle-class people who have a very, very different life experience and not a lot of experience engaging with service providers. And so how do you talk to them? How do you have those conversations? Are people seeing that in their practice as well? Like seeing a different clientele than you were seeing before?
We have a food program, we have a lunch program, and we serve about 350 to 400 lunches per day. But now we have women who work in the community coming for food.
Right.
But we never had that before. And that just is amazing to me. You see that they're dressed, like you can tell that they're working
Yeah.
and they're coming because they can't afford to bring their lunch or buy their lunch any longer. And then I just want to throw this other thing in that's really devastating, is the damage done to young people from crystal meth. That for me is another huge dilemma that I work with every day.
Mhm.
Young people who have done so much damage to their serotonin and who can never find any joy in anything when you sit with them and talk to them and they just go, you know, what's happy, what's
Yeah,
joy.
yeah.
One of the things that when we talk about like COVID and that like none of us were well, right? There were points that I think we were all struggling. And one of the
Yes.
things that I think like when I'm working with like mental health consumers or people with all these different types of barriers, right, is to be able to belong them in. Like to say that like we are all in this together. And I think like one of my favorite things with COVID, I call them gifts of COVID and that deprofessionalization, right? It was like nobody had their stuff together in
Right.
March of 2020, yet we all were able to do our jobs, right? So we can say like the professionals don't have to have their stuff together. And it's how do we have those conversations and make the lines that exist kind of disappear a little bit more, you know, and even like when we talk about like, you know, as Ani DeFranco says, women in the middle are learning what poor women have always known, right? How do we bring those, you know, how do we have those conversations of solidarity
Mhm.
and, you know, and of mobility, like political mobility and those types of
Yes,
things? Like,
yeah.
how do we say that we're all in this together? Because I
Yeah.
think that that's the strategy that I really like to employ is we belong together. Like I see you, we see each other.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I do. I love that. You know, creating opportunity for people to be part of community and to feel part of community. And I think it's so relevant for people who've been marginalized and who felt excluded and who feel like they don't belong because there's something wrong with them, because they're defective in some way, or because they're bad people, because they, for any variety of reasons. So, and I think there's something very beautiful about undermining the hierarchy that exists between ourselves and the clients that we serve. Is this we're somehow separate from, better than? No, we just happen to, maybe have had certain advantages that they didn't have, or got lucky at the right time. So breaking down some of those barriers. And I think also at the same time acknowledging that there is a difference between you and me, right? Like you're sitting across the table from me needing my help. And that's a power dynamic. That's a power relationship that I think is important to acknowledge. Like even I love that. I love we're all in this together. And half the time I don't have my shit together, right? Like I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure this out the best way that I can. I think is really important for, again, building trust and not, deprofessionalizing or undermining the hierarchy. And I also think it's important to acknowledge, like, I don't live in your shoes. I don't know what it's like to be homeless. I don't know what it's like to lose your kids. Like I can only imagine. Because people know, especially people who have lived a life, they are such good bullshit readers. Like they know right away. Yeah, go ahead.
So just about what you were just talking about, one of the things that I do, and like I feel like it works as long as you find a genuine way to do it, is I will say to this person, I've never had to deal with whatever it is, but you've been through a lot, clearly. And I'll say to them, like if they're having trouble disclosing stuff, I might say, Jesus, because you've had that you're dealing with, does this come up for you? Are you feeling like this? And so then I, like, without assuming that they're feeling this way, like I try to ask them. And then when I hear, this happens with women especially, but also other folk, when they say, oh, it must sound stupid, or I used to be able to do all these things and I was so on the ball, I was this, I was that, then I will talk to them and just say things like, with everything that you've been through and look where you are, or look what you just told me about that you've done, please be kind to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes just people, even when I can't help them, which happens often, actually, I have to refer them to other resources, just feeling like I heard them and didn't just say, oh, yeah, I can't help you, bye. It's huge, right? Feeling like you're human.
Yes.
And in my case, and I mean, you have to pick when you're going to do this and when you're comfortable. But because I have a disability and I've also dealt with anxiety, in some cases, I will actually disclose that depending on the client. Obviously, there's some who I would never disclose.
Right.
But just being able to say, when there's talk about brain fog, I'm like, I get it. I've had brain fog. I lost my keys yesterday. But this type of thing goes a long way, even when you can't give them what you wish you could give them.
Yeah, that was and I know we have a comment or a question online and we'll get to that next, but that was something that came up yesterday. There was a relatively new advocate who's working in the downtown east side who said, like, how do I deal with folks who, you know, they come to me and they legitimately need help and I can't, there's lots of stuff I can't help them with. And they're coming in frustrated and then they're getting mad at me, right? They're like, you know, and being, you know, fairly abusive about it, which is hard to take. So we had a conversation around the room that was really, really helpful about, like, how do you deal with that? And one of the things is that one of the participants was talking about was genuine empathy. Like, actually, like, acknowledging where somebody is in the moment. And again, as you said, like, it has to be heartfelt. It has to be real, because people will notice. But if you're coming from a place of like, yeah, this really sucks. Like, you've been, you know, doing all of this hard work to try and find, you know, some help. And here I am saying that, you know, that's not my mandate, or we don't do that kind of work, and I'm going to have to send you somewhere else. And that, of course, you're pissed. I totally get that. So that, like, actually interacting with people on a human level and recognizing their distress and responding to their distress, I think is really important, because yeah, there is oftentimes when people go somewhere and they identify a need or ask for help and people are like, sorry, we don't do that. Shut the door, right? Click, hang up the phone. Responding with some understanding and some empathy, I think at least makes the person feel heard in the moment. But also at the same time, like, being clear about what you can and can't do. Like, that's, you know, certainly gotten into trouble myself in my early days of wanting to do everything. Right. And having some pretty big latitude, like, to kind of define what it was that we were going to do in the program I was running. And learning that there were just things that we didn't have capacity, or we didn't actually have the knowledge and information to be able to do well. So, you know, when I was, you know, new to this work, I wanted to take on everything. And that was also setting people up for failure and disappointment as well. When I was extending my role definition beyond what I was actually capable of doing. Like, we inevitably fall into a bit of a counseling role. I think it's really hard not to, because people are coming to us with so much distress and just such a lack of support systems, like even friends and family, that we find ourselves being kind of a touchstone or a place of emotional support. And it's really easy to go down that road of like, well, I'll be that touchstone for you. But it's dangerous, right? One, because that's not what we're trained to do, or I'm assuming, right? Maybe some of the folks in the room are, but that's a very specialized skill set. And, you know, people, if you create an expectation that that's what your role is and that's what you're available for, and then maybe you've got like 5 or 6 other appeals that you've got to do and you can't see somebody and you have to turn them away, they're going to get pissed at you, right? They're going to be like, well, why'd you set up that expectation that I could come to you anytime? Sorry, I see that there's a couple comments, but I know there was somebody online who.
Well, I was just trying to get your attention because I knew we were in the corner of your eye. So it's just.
Okay.
I'll bring the mic over.
So very quickly, like when we talk about being that touchstone person, or, you know, Vicki Reynolds has a really great video on the zone of fabulousness.
Love her. She is the bomb.
And so, yeah, just, it's a really great, like, if you're like, oh my God, like, what does, like, how, like, oh, am I doing too much? Am I not doing enough? It's a really short video. She's brilliant. And so, yeah, it's a great resource for people.
Thanks, Andrea. Any time you can read or listen to Vicki Reynolds do it, she's just fantastic. And so much about community building, right? Like, and about how we need each other, and we need a kind of a basis of unity, or we need principles that we're committed to. And so much of our own wellness, like we talk about self-care and we talk about wellness, but really it's about living in community and taking care of each other. And she does it so much more articulately than I ever could.
Just wanted to comment on sort of like our ability to deal with all the problems that come over our desks. I was speaking with a client about a week ago, and I let them know that their circumstances were sort of outside of our scope, and that, you know, I didn't even know where to begin. Like, it was not part of what we do.
Yeah.
And the client on the phone was like, "Oh, just do this research and then you can call me back and help me." And I was like, and like in that moment, I've learned to be very blunt with people and not say like, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll do that research and I'll call you back." I was like, "No, I'm not doing that. I don't have time." If I tell you I'm going to do it, I'm just going to disappoint you in a week. You're going to call me. You're going to be more angry than you are right now. You know, so
Yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful, but a personal situation that came up
I
recently,
think,
but often.
right. Yeah, no, it does come up, right? Because we all have very specific mandates, whether it's the folks we can work with geographically, you know, maybe we only work with immigrant and refugee populations. Maybe we only work with sex workers. Like, we all have those mandates that we have to fulfill. And we also can't do every area of law, right? I mean, it's impossible. It's hard enough to be good at one or two areas, but let alone a number of them. So I think sometimes having those really, especially if it's somebody who's kind of a high conflict person. So someone who's litigious, we all have those folks, right? Who are very litigious and are like, "Oh, this happened to me this week and I want to sue this person and I want to complain about this person." And fair enough. That's how you walk through life. That's your survival skill. Right. Just give me 5 minutes, right? Just give me 5 minutes. You know, so in those situations, I think being really clear and very direct and very blunt about the fact is like, this is outside of the scope of my work. Let me see if I can connect you to somebody who can help you, right? But I don't do that work, and you would be much better served. This is a complicated area of law. This is your liberty that's at stake, or there's something very significant to you that's at stake. You want somebody working with you that actually knows what they're doing. So, you know, I think that's totally, I think most people would rather hear an unequivocal no, let's see what else we can put together for you, than a like, okay, well, see if I have time and maybe if I can get around to it. And then, you know, following up a week later and you saying, you know, "Sorry, I couldn't get it done," right? That would piss most people off, right? Yes. Yes.
You're like, "Oh my, I should not have agreed to do this." And you're like, "Oh, I've got this other thing that's way easier to do." And so
Yes.
the person calls you, like, it gets bad.
Totally.
It never ends well.
It never ends well. And it's interesting because the tittering and the empathy around the room was audible, because every one of us has done that probably multiple times. We're like, why did I take this case? Like, why? Yeah. So being choosy and selective and thoughtful about, okay, like, I really want to help. It's hard because we do this work because we want to help people, because we believe in justice. And so it's really hard to say no. But in a way, if we take a case that we're not really comfortable or capable or don't have the time to do, we are saying no. We're just saying it it's like breaking up with somebody, right? Like, "I'll call you next week. Let's get together in 2 weeks." Like, I would just rather hear, like, "I'm not interested. See ya." Right? Yeah, go ahead.
This is like a self-preservation as well as like for clients' sake. One of the things that I have learned is that I sleep a lot better if I am kind of the flip side of this. I didn't say yes to something or tried to say that our lawyers would do it or whatever. But I also, like, before referring them or like suggesting they try someone else, I like to know quite a bit about where I'm referring the person.
Thank you. Yes.
And then if like, say it's a very one-off situation and very unique, I'm pretty honest about, like, you know what, I don't know of the perfect resource for this. I really don't. You could try this, but please know, I'm not sure if they deal with it. Like, I'm really clear about those things. And if I think that it's like a really not great resource, like, I'll be honest that like, this probably isn't going to do it, but you could try, because I don't want to set someone up for that expectation. And it kind of goes with setting our own boundaries, but also like, I don't know, it helps me sleep at night, frankly.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. And it's actually one of the things I talk about when I'm not kind of all over the place like I am today. When I'm talking about like fragmented systems, is that, it's really important when you're, again, like how many bad referrals I got at the kettle. Like, people would send people to the kettle all the time, and I'd have to be like, I'm so sorry, like, you're sent here, we can't help you with that. And then they, people, are you at the kettle? Oh my God. Oh, you're me. So nice to meet you. Wonderful. Glad to hear things haven't changed. Yeah, so you still get all those bad referrals, right? And so people come to you, they're already, angry, they're already frustrated, they're terrified, right? They're coming to a place that they're unfamiliar with, like all that stuff that we have to think about. And then you tell them, sorry, can't do that. We don't do that. And then send them off somewhere else. And so the line continues, right? So one of the things I always tried to do to the best of my ability was to understand the referral I was making before I made it, right? So making that phone call, asking them, what's your intake procedure like? Like, who do you see? Like, how long is the wait? So that I could give that information to the client and at least know to the best of my ability that it was a good referral and what they should expect, right? Because especially for people with mental health issues, like trust, anxiety, safety are such big issues, right? Like, I think that's one of the reasons why the kettle is such an effective model, because it has that holistic kind of service, right? And people can, they don't necessarily just need to come to the advocacy service. They can hang out in the drop-in for a few weeks and kind of check things out, or go see the nurse and get some of their physical health attended to. But, just for a lot of people, even just stepping out of your door and being willing to ask for help is a huge barrier, like huge barrier. So I can at least do some of the work to help get somebody to the service that they need. And sometimes be honest and say, this, it's not the best place, or, some of their programs are a bit off or whatever, but this is really helpful, or they have these great peer supports there that I think you'll really benefit from. So I think that's an excellent point. Do we want to take like a 5-minute break? Or are we good to continue? How do folks feel? Ambivalent. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break then. I'm making the call. Okay, we're good? All right, let's get started. I can't believe how fast the time goes in these sessions. One of the things we were talking about yesterday, I don't know if folks know Sonia from Downtown Eastside. I've known Sonia for a long time, and she was saying, we got to do, these has to be an all day thing. I was like, yes, right? Like, we need so much more time to have these conversations because it's so important, and it's such a big factor in people's work, especially now. So I hope everybody got a chance to stretch and get some water or coffee, and we'll spend the next 45 minutes just chatting about things, which seems to be how things are going. So I hope that's cool with people. So some of the things that I felt or I learned were really important in some of the foundational things. And you're probably already doing a lot of this, or it's not new information to you. But just as some general principles, as I was talking about when we started, just having awareness of the impact of trauma and the impact of mental health, I think is really, really important. I know trauma-informed practice is like the new buzzword, but there is a lot of that work and training that has a lot of really valuable basic information in it that is helpful for working with any client. And I think one can assume that most of the folks, if not all of the folks that we're working with, have had traumatic experiences, whether that's a single traumatic experience or multiple or complex experiences of trauma. And so understanding that that's present and that has implications for how people's bodies and brains function, and how what able they are to engage with us, as well as what we can do to hopefully mitigate the effects of trauma and not do any. I was just saying to Adam, sometimes our work is really, how do I not do any further harm to this person, right? Like that's sometimes the most we can achieve. So having trauma awareness, mental health awareness, thinking about space, what our space looks like, how our space is set up, is also a really key component in creating safety, creating comfort, creating conditions necessary for people to transmit as well as receive information. It's not something I really ever thought about until, again, people told me, like, these lights, like, I can't talk to you with these lights. These lights are ridiculous. Like, I'm completely distracted. Or there's so, and again, recognizing that we all have limitations on the kind of physical space we can create. Like, some of us work in environments where we're, there are a whole bunch of people we work with, or, we might work out of a drop-in center where we're just in a corner. But thinking about, like, the fact that, especially if you're someone who's dealing with, say, for example, like you're in the middle of a psychosis, right? Whether that's drug induced, whether that's because you have schizophrenia or a bipolar disorder, there's a lot of stimuli in the environment. There's no way that you're going to be able to concentrate on having a conversation about your residential tenancy matter. Like, it's just impossible. It's hard enough to do even in a quiet, low stimulus environment, but yeah, like if there's a lot of chaos going on. So thinking about physical space, right? And safety and how we set up our physical space to be able to provide as calming and relaxing of an environment as we possibly can, and as low of a stimulation environment as we possibly can. So thinking about physical space, time. I mean, if I learn nothing in my time as an advocate, the biggest takeaway I had is that everything is going to take more time with folks with mental health and substance misuse issues. Absolutely. And that means from the very beginning of that initial intake, that initial contact. And again, that might be about trust and disengagement. Like, I don't trust you. I don't know who you are. I don't know, somebody told me to come see you, but you're not my friend. I don't know anything about you. It might take a much longer time to get to a place where they're like, okay, you're cool, I can trust you. And also just information solicitation. Not just, and also, people might need more breaks. Like, I don't know if smoking is still a big thing. I assume it's still a big thing, but I would give clients lots of opportunity to go have smoke breaks or go get another coffee, and just again, we all exist within limitations of time and resources. There's only so many hours in the day, but if we can give as much latitude for time to get even just that basic initial information, it's really helpful. And also knowing that steps are going to take longer in the process, right? We might have an agenda and an outline of when we think things need to get done. And sometimes you're dealing with, that's beyond your control. Like, we have to file this appeal in 30 days. So there isn't a lot of latitude, but where you can give it or where you can provide extra supports for things to get done. Like, if it's a PWD application, of course you want that to get done as soon as possible, because that's going to give somebody extra benefits, more money, but you might be able to give a bit more flexibility on how that gets done. Again, we've already talked about being honest about what you can offer, right? That's really, really being clear about the fact that, this is the service we can provide. These are the things we can do. These are the things that we can't do, which hopefully mitigates frustration later on when, because you haven't told somebody, you haven't made promises to somebody that you can't keep. I found that to be really, really important. giving people time to tell their story. I mean, I don't know. There's always a balance here in terms of how you, and again, I think individuation of approach is really important. What's going to work with one person and be really effective with one person. Like some people need you to be really blunt. Some people need you to be like, you know, just give me the facts, ma'am. Like as simple as it is. And other people need a lot of empathy. They need it slow. They need it soft. Some people love it when you swear. Some people hate it when you swear. So it's about gauging, right? Like how do I work with this individual person? What are they going to be responsive to? What are they going to relate to? But I always found it was helpful to give a certain amount of unstructured time for people to tell their story, a little bit of their story, like not endless time, but open up the conversation when someone was coming to see me or I was doing an intake for the first time, giving a bit of unstructured time, again, open-ended, just for people to give me some basic information about what was going on. Again, that allowed me to assess some things about them, like how they speak, you know, how they frame their lives, how they frame their issues, and, you know, allowed me to, you know, in my own mind, think about, okay, how do I want to build on what they're telling me? What are some questions that I can come up with that are going to help this story move forward and then move into something a little bit more structured? I think it's really difficult for people, especially people who've had a lot of experience with institutional settings, to come into a room and have somebody go, okay, what's your name? You know, tell me what happened, you know, like in a way that's, you know, some people respond well to that, but I think most people respond more effectively to a more open kind of conversation. That's my experience anyway. Yes, please. And thank you.
So, but in regards to, and I know letting them tell their story and giving them that space, but also knowing too that there are some time constraints with appointments and whatnot. What do you do then to then, if they're going on and on and on and on, politely transitioning to getting back to work? Because I know there's times where you're like, I don't want to cut them off right now. They're, you know, they're right into it. They're passionate about it, but really need to do this, but trying to wrangle them back in. What's kind of your take on that? Because I know we try different things, but it's hit and miss sometimes.
Yeah. And I think that's the answer. Some things work. Sometimes some things work other times. Yeah, just I'll make a comment and then absolutely invite other folks to offer their contributions. One of the things I would often do when I met with someone was be really clear about how much time I had. So I would say, you know, I've got half an hour, I've got an hour. And, you know, you've told me that one of the things that you want to get done today is to get this form filled out or to, you know, get this piece of an application done. So within that hour, that's what we have time for. And then, so if things were going astray, or they were going on a, you know, some kind of tangent or telling me a story that had nothing to do with what was going on, that would be kind of a useful frame to bring them back and to say, okay, like I hear that that's really shitty that happens. We do have, you know, you have said, and again, putting it back on people, like this is a priority that you've said is important to you. Doesn't really matter to me whether this gets done. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say this doesn't matter to me, but like giving it back to people. This is your life. This is a choice that you've made, that you want to do this. And again, saying like, this is how much time we have. And, you know, if we're going to get that done, maybe we can talk about that next time you come. Or sometimes the best thing to do is if someone is in a real crisis about something, or it's like really on their minds, maybe the best thing that you can do is still be clear about the fact that you have an hour, but give them that time to be able to just stream of consciousness or express what it is that they need to express and know that you're going to get that done next week. I mean, but and also being careful of the fact that you can't always do that, right? So it's you know, it's really hard to gauge what the right approach is. But I find being clear up front with like, I've got 15 minutes. Like I would have clients who would call, who I again would call high conflict clients. And they would call and they would want me to talk to them endlessly about whatever had happened to them in their day or the latest injustice that they had experienced or latest drama. And I would just be like, "Oh, okay, I'm happy to talk to you. I'm really glad you called. It's nice to hear from you. I've got 10 minutes. And at 9 minutes, I would be like, I've got 1 minute left. I have another client waiting outside. I'm going to hang up the phone. And I would just do it. It sounds awful. Like I never enjoyed doing it. But if I didn't do it, I could be on the phone all day with that person every single day. And it's not useful for me. And it's certainly not useful for them. You had a comment, and then I think there was a comment here and here and here. Yay, I love it.
Hi, I just want to make sure this sounds like something that you had just said not to do, your name, address, phone number, that kind of stuff. I learned early on what works best in what I do is I don't ask people how they are. When you meet somebody and, hi, how are you today? And oh, good. But our clients don't come in good.
Yes.
And I find that if you ask them how they are, you're going to start the meeting off in a negative tone right away. And you can be up to a half an hour hearing how they really are. So typically what I do is when I go and get my client, I introduce myself, bring them to my office and say, okay, take a seat. I understand you're here to do a disability application here today. And then we can talk a little bit and then we get into the details. But I just find that nicety that everybody uses, how are you today? I find it just sets things off in a negative tone. And and you can spend a lot of time getting off topic and what you don't need to.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. It's like, when, oftentimes people are like, oh, you're asking because you genuinely want to know. It's not one of those social niceties that we all engage in, like, oh, how are you? Sometimes, I think it depends on the client. Like sometimes I want to ask that question because that's the only way to engage them at all, right? It's the only way to get from, I don't know who you are, I don't trust you, to, okay, a few weeks down the road, we can actually start doing the substantive work. But I think you're totally right. Like you have to be really careful about how do you set this up? How do you set it up? And if you're starting out on somebody, sobbing for 20 minutes about how shitty their life is, maybe that's not the approach you want to take. So again, it's so nuanced, right? There were a couple of comments at this table.
What you had said there, I do a lot of drop in and just random stuff.
Yeah.
And what generally works is when I see somebody for the first time, the first thing I usually say is like, well, obviously you're not having the best day of your life because you're here in my office to see me. What's going on? Yeah. Why are you here today?
Yeah.
And that usually just because they're ready with a story.
Yes.
When you kind of say, I know you're having a crappy day. Like nobody comes to see me when they're happy.
Exactly. Yeah. And
helps.
I love the immediacy of that connection too. Like that's why one of the things I love about a drop-in advocacy service or like something that's super immediate is that someone's getting a connection with somebody right away. And it's giving them that opportunity to just like see a friendly face, like hear what your voice sound like, even if you're just like with them for 15 minutes where you're just getting the basics. I just think that immediacy, as much as I know not everybody can do it, but I think it's really important.
I work almost entirely appointment based. And so what happens is clients say, oh, hey, how are you? And I say, I'm good. Is this still an okay time for us to meet? Or is this still an okay time for us to work together? And then you're still getting a lot of the information about if something's going on, you need to know, but you're not asking that, like, how are you?
Yeah.
And getting that stuff. So that's been my one little secret tip. And one of the things, like I like the idea of trauma informed is I tend to think that when we talk about trauma informed, we're talking about certain clients. So I like to think about it as generosity of spirit. How do I have a generous spirit with everybody that I work with? And one of the things that we were talking about is like that setting parameters. So I'm not doing this with my mental health consumers and, with people that have trauma. I'm doing this with everybody.
Yeah.
And so every single call, and to the point that like I've got one client, I've been working with her for 4 years, and I start every call. I'm like, this is about me. This is what we're going to do today. Like, and if we have follow-up appointments, I understand we're doing this today. Is this still what you want to do? And then that way it kind of creates almost a social contract that keeps us so that way I can say, I understand that there's a whole lot of things going on. today we were going to do this legal aid application. Is that
Mhm.
still what you want to use your time with
Love
me?
it.
Because we've got about 20 more minutes. I'm going to need that 20 minutes to get you through. If you want to do something else, we can do that, but it means that we're going to be adding this time and we
Yeah.
can renegotiate.
Yeah.
But I really like creating that social contract right from the beginning and doing that and setting the parameters every single time, even when clients think it's boring.
I love that. It's like universal precautions, right? In a sense, like we just assume that anyone could be affected by something and therefore we need to be careful. We should assume that everyone needs a generosity of spirit or a trauma-informed practice. I think that's brilliant. And I also love the way in which that gives an opportunity for someone to make some choices or to have some agency. So to ask the questions like, does this time still work for you? And hopefully you've had you've developed a relationship with someone. So, like, okay, Andrea takes her meds in the morning. And so she's a wreck until 2:00. Or I know that, her medication is most effective around 10 a.m. and the voices aren't quite as present. So we've set up that kind of schedule, but you're giving people that opportunity for choice and collaboration right in that moment by saying, is this still a good time for you? We've talked about getting this legal aid application done. Is that still something that you want to do? Right. I don't think we can underestimate or undervalue how important those little things are, right? Because people who are that marginalized have so little opportunity for choice and so little opportunity for affirmation. I love it. Thank you for sharing that. Oh,
If you want to talk first, that's okay. Okay. Just to comment on the how are you and getting the responses. I find that if I'm asking how are you, I have to be prepared to get the real talk,
right.
like asking how are you is sort of like this social formality among acquaintances, and you don't you're asking it just to be nice, but you don't really care about what the answer is going to be.
Yeah.
But with our clients, you really have to buckle up sometimes. And if you don't want to know, then just don't ask it.
Yeah.
To answer your question about sort of when conversations or meetings are sort of going off the rails, I think importantly, you need to set strong boundaries with the person. And sometimes off the rails might be because my objective of the meeting is not where the meeting is going, and you have to accept that.
Yeah.
But if you're telling the client I have 20 minutes, the next time I can see you is 2 weeks from now, and you stick to that, then at least the client knows that they're not going to be able to see you to resolve a particular issue until later down the road. And if you stick to that, then I find that clients respect that and realize that this is their opportunity and they might not have another one in a little while.
Yeah.
So sometimes these strategies work and sometimes they fail catastrophically. And it's how do you know? You have no idea.
Yeah.
One thing I figured out both from a relationship building, but also possibly a boundary setting. I mean, it's easy in some ways from my office, but I will often say to someone, is there anything that you need or that you need me to know to make this more accessible to you? And actually clients do tell me that they've gone to other services who don't seem to know or understand disability. So, but sometimes I literally get clients who go, I really can't stay on topic. So it's okay for you to tell me to shut up. Now, I've never said to a client, shut up, obviously, but sometimes just by doing that, it's they're so relieved to be able to tell you, I need you to steer me back to the conversation or whatever. So it helps build rapport, but also helps put those boundaries in. And frankly, from a disability advocacy point of view, it's proactive, it's anti-ableism in practice. And I think it's client-centered.
Absolutely.
So I thought it kind of comes as second nature to me, but may not be a thing that everyone thinks about.
Yeah.
It also helps because sometimes your client has an invisible disability, as with mental health is often invisible unless
Absolutely.
they're severely symptomatic for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think that's really, I think that's such a good approach for all the reasons that you've named, being client-centered, being anti-ableist. I think it's also, to get in terms of efficiency and in terms of helping the client get what they want, actually being able to identify with them, what are your communication needs, right? I can make all kinds of assumptions about how you communicate what your level of literacy is, how you best articulate, how you best receive information. But that's just my assumption. So to actually have a conversation, especially if you're working with people who have, like for most people, illness is variable, right? Like wellness is variable. So people have times when they're not symptomatic in their illness or they're relatively well. And they can communicate and they do have capacity to articulate what their needs are. And so having those conversations about, okay, how do we, what's the most effective way for us to communicate when you aren't well? I think is really, really a good conversation. And some people have, you know, not everybody has the insight to be able to say, well, you know, visual cues are really helpful for bringing me back on track, or verbal cues. If you say this word, and I'm like doing the word salad thing and I'm all over the place, that's going to bring me back to the fact that we're talking about this. So not everyone knows that. Like, I mean, that's generally true of the population, right? Like not all of us have a lot of self-awareness, but some people are really well able to identify what it is that they need when they're symptomatic, because people are living kind of in a dual world sometimes, like they're part here and then they're part out there. So they're not completely detached. They're just struggling to communicate with a world that doesn't understand them. So if we can understand what their preferences are when they're relatively well, that can help us when they're not as well.
I just wanted to include our Zoom participants
please.
who shared a couple of their opening lines, as you all did. Don McConnell says, I think people are coming in instead of saying, how are you? And Heather from CMHA South Caribou says, I asked them, how can I help you today? Straight to the point.
It's a little less laden. It's a little less heavy, right? It's like, this is my role. I'm here to help. Yeah, for sure. But that was it. All right. Excellent. Okay. So where were we? Just going back to this list of tips and tricks, the way we communicate is really, the way we solicit information and the way we communicate information back is really important. And I like to talk a lot and I am very long-winded by nature. And my brain goes a lot faster than sometimes I like it to. So actually being able to break things down and be really clear about the questions that I'm asking, first of all. So it's very easy to ask a 3-part question without even understanding that you're asking a 3-part question. Do you know what I mean? Like how easy it is to, like, I think that's, you know, the question that I'm asking is fairly simple, but in fact, it's got like layers to it. And, you know, okay, that's fine. For me, it might be fine in a conversation that you and I are having, but for somebody else, it's completely distracting and overwhelming. So really thinking about like the simplicity of both your questions as well as the instruments that you're using. So we have paperwork that we have to get done, right? Like we have consent forms that need to be signed. We have intake forms that need to be done. How can we simplify those in a way that makes them as accessible and simple for people as possible? So really thinking about, you know, when you're interviewing someone and you're trying to get the information that you need to figure out, one, what the issue is and how you're going to resolve it, really breaking it down into simple questions, and actually checking understanding, I think is really important as well. I mean, I don't know how many times you folks have done this, but like someone will be telling me something about my computer and I'll be like, oh yeah, totally got it. I have no idea what they just said. I have no interest. I just want it to be fixed. I think people do that a lot more than we actually know, because people don't want to like, oh, they're going to think I'm stupid, or they're going to like, you know, they're going to be frustrated with me because I haven't got it the first time. So I think oftentimes people walk away not really understanding what it is that we're doing or what their options are. So I think in addition to being really clear and direct with your questions, also being really clear about the fact that they actually understand what it is that you're telling them, and finding ways to check for understanding, so that hopefully, you know, you're on the same page and everybody's getting what's going on. And it can be a really useful exercise to help you make sure you know what you're doing. Like one of the hardest things I think about teaching any kind of subject matter is breaking it down into something simple that anyone can understand. Like a really good teacher can take a complicated, complicated subject matter and, teach it to like a grade 6 student. And not saying that people with mental health issues are dumb at all, because there's a huge range, just like with everybody else. But if we can explain things simply and clearly, it's an indication that we actually know what we're doing. And if the client knows what they're doing, they're actually giving informed consent to moving forward. And that's also true for options, right? Like people actually understanding what their options are, and us, being able to really feel fully confident at the end of the day that I've said, okay, these are the 3 things that we can do. Usually there's not 3 options, but let's pretend there are 3 options. The client understands the implications of and what the reasonably foreseeable consequences are of these decisions. I feel good about the fact that they have made decision X and we can move forward. So checking that understanding, I think, is really important. Being collaborative, right? Like giving people as much opportunity to be a part of setting the agendas for the meetings, deciding what's actually going to be discussed, what the priorities are, and then obviously, being able to make decisions, even if they're little decisions. Like again, I don't think we can undervalue how important those little moments of agency are for people. Like if you've had a lot of control or your sense of safety taken away from you, being able to be given back some semblance of control, even over little processes or about, small little things, can be really, really empowering, and it's something that you can really build on. So I've always found that it's really helpful to be as collaborative as possible, while at the same time, again, recognizing that, you have time limitations and you also have limits on what it is that you can actually do for someone. Like, I feel like that's the thing that advocates are always juggling, is trying to be, collaborative, trying to be client-centered, trying to be trauma-informed in the work. And also knowing that you have really busy work lives, and, you only have so much time, and you have high caseloads of clients that you're trying to work with. So I think that's something that folks really struggle with. I don't know. I mean, is that as true now as it was when I left the kettle 6 years ago? So how do people do that? How do you find that balance of like leaving at the end of the day feeling like, okay, I got done the things I wanted to get done, but I did it in a way that I can feel good about? Anybody? What's that? That's what you think about at the end of the day. Right. You're to make people stay less shitty?
Yes.
Okay, love it.
And it's like, did I do my job today?
Yeah.
And if I did my job, like I find that because that's the thing, like there's always going to be more calls. There's always going to be more people, but it's like everybody that I served today, I did what was realistic.
Right.
That I could do.
Yeah.
And I did it to the best of my ability.
Yeah. And did it take you a long time to get there?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Just for people who are a little bit newer to this work, like that takes a while to be able to come to that place where you're like, yeah, okay, that's a reasonable standard.
Yeah.
For me to meet.
Yeah. It took long, hard path.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
I just wanted to add too that, I think what you said, just, I try every day. Every person that I meet with, if they leave that meeting feeling a little bit better or a little less stressed or a little whatever better, then I did my job.
Right.
When I first started, it was all about the tangible outcomes and like getting things to the finish line.
Right.
And, now I know, like if I push 6 things a step forward in a day, that was still a successful day. I may not be able to
Absolutely.
see it, but like I
Right.
can feel it.
Yeah. That is such an important point, and I think something that definitely comes with some experience. When I first started doing the work, I was so attached to outcomes. Like I was so attached to like, oh, how many appeals did I get done this month? And how many hearings did I go to? And how many times was I successful? And, you know, it was a weird way of thinking, but I was young and pretty naive at the time. And also like I would take it really personally when I would put in a whole bunch of work on something and then the client would abandon project, right? You know, we've all been there. And I really had to learn, like, I cannot be attached to this outcome, right? Like my job, I am being paid, not well, but I am being paid to do this application. I'm being paid to do this appeal. I'm being paid to do whatever it is that this person has requested of me. Whether or not they decide, ultimately it's their priority, has nothing to do with me. And if I'm invested in the end result, and it's not to say I don't care. Of course, I want the best for this person. I want them to keep their housing. I want them, you know, to have a successful end result, but I cannot be attached to the choices that they make because their lives are chaos, right? And maybe, you know, they need to fall off the end of the earth for 6 months and come back. And that was really valuable for my own well-being and also how I interacted. Because I'm sure there were some people, you know, when I was in my early days who knew I was kind of pissy about it, right? When they would come back. I tried to be like as professional as possible, but you know, we sometimes carry stuff in ways that is not always obvious to us. And learning that was so important for me, just not being attached.
I wanted to ask about creative advocacy in the sense, for example, if I can't get through the front door, and then I'll try to look for a little window that's open at the back that I can crawl into, right? But I find sometimes that some of the women who I'm trying to help are so afraid of that. Like,
right.
I just want to go through the front door. I
Yeah.
don't want to go through that window in the back. And
Yeah.
it scares them that, and I tell them the risks. I
Yes.
explain all the risks, but I also explain that if we get away with this, you're going to be in a better place. So let's try, but you have to be so super careful with some mental health diagnoses because
Absolutely.
not just to use the word paranoid, I'd like to say just afraid because just like you said, they've had trouble before making decisions and the decision that they made may have gone against them.
Absolutely.
So trying to get
Right.
someone, for example, to do a reconsideration request, just so that you can make sure that you can get their reconsideration request funds.
Yes. Right.
Right?
Right.
You know you're going to lose.
Yes. Right.
Like, you
on
know
a
you can-
substantive point, you're going to
Exactly.
lose.
Yeah,
but
you're going to lose.
yeah.
But you're only going to have to pay $20 a month for the rest of your life or what, you know. what I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah.
And that way you're going to still be able to pay your rent.
Mm-hmm.
But to get some people to get that part of rent, you can't do it at all.
Yeah.
And that's heartbreaking because you know that that's the answer for the moment.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that. I mean, I love that how you approach that in the sense of, I think, acknowledging the fact that, yeah, of course you want to get in the front door. Everybody should get in the front door. This shouldn't be so hard. Why is, you know, like I get that. And just empathizing with the fact that there is so much injustice and unfairness and scrooginess in that system. And really giving people, what I really like about what you said is giving people the information to make as much of an informed decision as they possibly can. So to say, this is unconventional, but it's not out of practice. It's permitted by the legislation. There's nothing saying we can't do it. You're not going to get in trouble for it. But you need to know that the likelihood is it's not going to be successful. And if we're not successful, you are going to be in an overpayment, and that's what it's going to look like. And giving it back to that person to make that choice. And, you know, you can provide reassurance, you can provide information, but again, you're fighting against what might be partly their illness, right? Just to be afraid of the world and afraid of stepping out of line, or again, their history of like, oh, when I stepped out of line, things didn't go very well for me. And I get it, right? Because we see those little opportunities for like, oh, we can just make it a little bit better. But the client's just not willing to go there. But I think you're approaching it exactly how it needs to be approached. Yeah. Are we missing anything online? No?
No.
No? Okay. All right. Yes. Yeah, please.
I'm relatively new. I've been in this for about 2 years, and we've been recently doing an organizational kind of logic model evaluation framework. And in doing
Sounds
that,
fun.
It's and part of it is that we're asked to come up with our own metrics of how do we measure success and our outcomes. And
Right.
part of that we're borrowing off of the law foundation reports that we do every month, where
Right.
we look at certain stats, how many hearings, how many people seen, how many successful hearings.
Right.
And I feel that there's a disconnect sometimes between the numbers we're asked to report and the type of success. Yeah, it's like success could be super amorphic.
Yes.
It's not always going to be a successful hearing.
Yeah.
It might be a better loss than it could have been.
Right.
So,
I-
and some of it's a disconnect in.
And I love that. And I hope that you're finding some way to translate that for the folks who don't actually do the work that you do. Because sometimes it's like this person got heard. This person left that hearing, they lost the hearing, and it was shitty that they lost the hearing, but they actually walked away from that hearing feeling like they mattered and their arguments were heard and they were fairly assessed. And that is a success. And there might be people who've gone through a similar kind of process who might have some tips for you on how to approach that.
Calling back to Dr. Vicki Reynolds, what we do at Rise, and again, because we're appointment based, so we actually can send out automatic emails every time a person has a client, or every time a client has an appointment. And we ask the two things that clients care about: were we kind and were we useful? And every single client gets asked, were we kind and were we useful, in different sort of ways. But that for us really tracks the important thing in the work, which is what clients care about, and that we were kind and that we were useful. So throwing that out to the universe.
Love it. Okay. So we have about 10 more minutes. This has gone really quickly. So I'd like to, I know we've had a lot of conversation and a lot of questions and a lot of feedback from the room, which is exactly how I was hoping this would go, because I think it's so much more useful. But wondering if there's any topics or areas or questions that people want to talk about over the next 10 minutes that we can workshop as a group. Please.
We're in a really depressed economy, and there's no hope for the young people there. There's no way out. And what I'm having a really hard time with is it doesn't, they'll show up once, and then I always create a list because there's always 18,000 things going on. Like, okay, you guys, when you come back, we can talk about this, we can talk about that. But they don't come back. It's almost like they can't be bothered to help themselves. They can't be bothered to help themselves. It's just like hopeless. And I'm finding that really hard, because when I was young, like in my 20s and all that, I was just like anything. I was up for adventure. I was up for trying anything. And I think that they're just sitting there not helping themselves. And I just can't understand that. I need help with that. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, now that I'm an old person, I do think that, if we're talking about people who are, in their 20s or I think it's a totally different world than the world that I grew up in the sense of opportunity, right? Like the sense of what was possible. I grew up in a poor working class family. So it wasn't like the world is your oyster kind of situation, but I felt like, if I went to school and if I, worked really hard, I could possibly have a good job and a house, and they're not options for people anymore. They really aren't. Like, it's bleak. Not only that, but apocalypse, everyone, right? Climate change. So I do think there is at minimum, a disaffection and a despair that exists among lots of people. I see you, just one sec. That is really hard to overwhelm. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see such high rates of substance misuse among young people, is because it's like, what's the point, right? It provides a temporary pleasure. And, you know, when we're in that decision-making process, we're not thinking about 5 years from now when our brain chemicals don't work anymore. So it's a really hard one, right? It's a really hard one. And I think trying to maintain some level of engagement with people who are disengaged is kind of multifold. And I think a lot of it is about us doing the work when we can to stay engaged, right? Like finding places where people hang out, or organizations or places where people are connected that we might go, oh, I'm going to drop in there, you know, and say hello, or give them a call, right? Like most young people have phones, like just give them a call or a text and say, hey, I'm still here if you want to move on, like, so that they feel like they're okay, there's somebody that cares and wants to stay engaged. And I think it also asks us to reflect on our own practice about how we're approaching, because I think people need different approaches, and I think how we might approach somebody of our own generation versus how we approach young people is very, very different. And I'm not saying that I have those skills, because I really don't, and it's something that I've really been thinking about. The fact that I need to get better at that. But there might be organizations that you can connect with or partner with, or develop some kind of coordinated response to, where young people are hanging out and feel attached to, where you can look at, okay, well, how am I accommodating their needs rather than expecting, and I'm not targeting you personally, I hope you don't take it that way, but how can I change my practice and approach so it's better for those folks rather than expecting them to come to me and make it work on my terms, right? Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and sometimes it might be doing like a follow-up 6 months later, right? Or, you know, just to remind, right? Sorry, there was a comment. I think there's some more thoughts and comments, so please go ahead.
I just wanted to say, like, acknowledging when I'm working with younger people and they have this kind of bleak outlook, like I acknowledge it with them, like, yeah, you're right. There is no real, like, this current systems that we're operating in don't work for you. They don't work for me either.
Yeah.
But here's the deal. If we can fight against this with this issue, that's one way we can hopefully poke enough holes in the system to tear it down and make it, and then we can work on your generation making it work for you, just like the previous generation made it work for them.
Yeah.
And that sometimes helps.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just try.
And the other thing, just I'd love to hear what you have to say. One more thing might be like that you were saying, and maybe I'm taking what you said, misinterpreting it a little bit, but maybe the list of 18 things that you're creating is too much. Maybe it's like, okay, like you're hearing the 18 things that they're saying, but knowing they're in despair and lack of motivation could be like, okay, well, let's work on this one thing. What's your first priority? Let's just focus on that for the next little while. Because it could be that they're going, oh my God, I mean, we've all felt that way, right? Where it's like, oh, I need to lose weight and my relationship's not great and God, I need to make more money. And then you're just like, forget it. I'm just going to watch TV, right? So it might be scaling back the expectations of what you're going to achieve. Hi.
Hi. I just want to share that I'm not sure about local youth, but before coming to the legal advocacy program, I was working with the newcomer and refugee youth. And I really have a passion to explain to youth what is their future or how that can affect their families and themselves in the future. So when they're coming to Canada as newcomer, I'm just giving them options. Like, first, I provide information about the social system in Canada, and then basic laws about Canada. For example, I can explain a little bit about the Youth Act, criminal law, what is your rights and responsibilities in Canada, because it helps. As a newcomer and refugee myself, like a few years ago, I
Right.
was lost
Right.
as newcomer youth, and I didn't know what to do because I didn't know the system, I didn't know the laws, and I didn't know what to do. And of course, like every newcomer, they have stress and depression.
Of course.
If you can't help them at that time, then yeah, the circumstances that they live in
Mhm.
can be very harmful. So what I say to them that you can be, actually you are a future in like a future of Canada.
Right.
And what you can do is to be a leader instead of choosing bad things.
Mhm.
So be a leader. What is your purpose in this life? Like they said, oh, to help people. Okay, how you can help people?
Mhm.
And usually we had peer support groups and leadership trainings, and we touched base on different topics. And those youth, they really felt that they are leaders.
Right.
And then they became leaders in their own community because we worked with different communities.
Right.
And just this sense that you're a leader, it's already a huge responsibility. And you cannot step back because you are a leader and people count on you. And I was saying, okay, you're a newcomer and now you're a leader. You should think about other refugees that are coming to Canada. And you have to bring some, I know like you are bringing some positive stuff with you too, like among those stress and depression. But you should be someone, a role model, and to demonstrate something good.
Yeah.
And so people won't say that you're a burden into
Yeah.
economy.
Right.
So
Well, they will
it really
anyway, but
helps.
you can forget about
And
them.
I can say that one of the youth, newcomer youth, came to me and said, Ms. Kai, either connect me with a counselor or I will be using like those substances. Yeah.
Right.
And very, very openly and clearly they stated what they want.
Yeah.
Because I also explained about counseling sessions and comparing with our cultures. Counseling sessions is not appreciated in many cultures because if you go to a counselor, it means you're a crazy person. No one will give you a job. Same as if someone was out of jail. So, but no, you're explaining the system, like the rules and the policy of this country and what is appropriate, what is not. Like it is very, very normal if you go and see counselor. Like counseling sessions are very helpful in this country. And no
So
one will think
demystifying
about
that for them a little
Exactly.
bit. Yeah.
Yes.
And I love that idea that you both talked about, you know, identifying where people are feeling really lost and feeling despairing and feeling like, you know, there's this big system, this big new, whether it's a big new world that they've just arrived at, or like, you know, this big monolith of like decision makers that they want to fight against, and identifying an opportunity in that despair to be a change maker. Right. And, you know, that's not everybody's role, and not everybody has the capacity or the resources to be a change maker. But I think telling people that they have that ability, even if it's on a small scale, and kind of turning that despair into some kind of action, I think is really an awesome approach when you think it's appropriate, right? Because that's where change actually really happens, right? And telling people, yeah, you're a leader. You have skills and experience that nobody else has, and that needs to be shared with the world. And you know, some of the people that I worked with at the Kettle, you know, I saw them at their lowest point, and you know, they became some of the, you know, like within the organization and within the community, like real leaders and change makers in terms of how people with mental illness are seen and creating programming and doing all kinds of cool stuff. So yeah, I love the idea of like saying like, you can do something about it. Even if it's just this little piece, this can make change. And the last thing I want to say before we wrap up is I think one of the things we need to do, and I've been working in collaborative cross-sectoral responses for the last 5 years, and I think that's something we need to do a lot more of. Some of the work that I had been doing sort of over the last year and a half was really looking at helping communities that work mostly in the anti-violence sector, so victim services, figure out how to be more responsive to young people who've experienced sexual violence. And, you know, it's a huge issue. There's a huge lack of engagement. Like a lot of people, women, folks who've experienced sexual violence don't disclose, they don't feel comfortable going to mainstream organizations. And so one of the things that we really encouraged and I really encouraged was building partnerships. Like you've got the gender-based violence lens and expertise and counseling expertise. This organization has all the youth. They know how to talk to people. They know how to get the word out in the community about, you know, like they just can reach that audience in a way that us old fogies cannot. So why not actually work together? And I think that's something, you know, being back here at the conference, having been away from advocacy, direct advocacy for a while, I think there's so many ways that we could build better connections amongst people who are all doing really fabulous work. And I think that's kind of the wave of moving forward in the future, because we all need more support and we all need to like build on the amazing knowledge and skills and expertise that exist in all these different sectors, and because it's really hard to do this work alone. So yeah, I think that's our time. Thanks, everybody. It was a real pleasure. Thanks, folks online.